So we're going to have a relatively informal conversation. I have a couple of questions for our colleagues from New Lines. And then since it's a full house, we'll open it up for a lot of questions and discussion from you. We have a number of NYU students and others who participated in the practitioner workshop with the New Lines editors who are here in the audience, and it's their first chance to meet everyone from New Lines in person, so they'll have some questions as well, and then we'll invite you for a reception at the end, and there is food on the way. I want to start with a question for everyone, and I'll start with Hassan first, and I guess we can go in the order that we're sitting in. And that is, I'd like you to all tell us the origin story of New Lines. So we're going to talk about journalism broadly in the region, but through the lens of what you've all been doing. If you can tell us briefly the origin story of New Lines, of how, I think you were all on the founding team, right? All of you are basically the founding editors. And if you can put it for context for us around your own experience living and working as journalists in the Middle East, including for Western news outlets, which I think all of you have done. You also, I think, all worked at the National, except Rasha didn't work at the. Oh, you did? Oh, wow. Okay. I'm the only one who didn't work for the National.
She doesn't have
everywhere.
Yeah.
Not just on this panel.
Possibly, yes. And then if you can tell us how those experiences, I know it's a three-part question, it's completely unfair. Just how these experiences, your experiences in the region, shaped your approach to starting a new publication. And the core of it is, in a lot of ways, you are all living out a journalistic dream, in that journalists often think they don't like the places they're working for, the places they're reporting for, and they get to start a new publication, and you've done this. So whichever pieces of this you'd all like to take, we'll start with Hassan.
Yeah, as a proof of how much we enjoy it, I think people like Karim and Rasha haven't had a holiday since we started, and I don't expect them to ask for a holiday for the next 1-2 years. No, so it depends. So the question, conceptually, I think the story is long, like how the idea of building something.
We're doing the news brief first.
But the news brief is basically we started thinking about it kind of seriously around 2019. The idea was to establish something that fills a gap in the way Western media and local media in the region cover the region, and both have their own flaws, despite the fact that there are great journalists from on both sides, obviously, as Trump would say, both sides. And the idea was, the gap was obviously that the bandwidth when it comes to covering the Middle East has always been limited when it comes to basically the way Western media covers the region. And that was based on all our experiences, working in different publications. Even though we did good work here and there, kind of we were able to navigate how the mainstream media works, and we were able to write, all of us, to write to Western publications. But we're always with the limitation, like, you can only, say so much. And you have to also frame your findings and observations in a certain way. We said that there's
a limited amount of time.
Exactly. So it's a very limited space, limited also in terms of what can you say in terms of like depth and detail and so on. So I always joke that people say this is too much into the weeds, and say what's wrong with weeds, and in the sense that you want texture, you want the detail, because that's what brings the story to life. The personal story, the reportage, the details that are left out usually are more important. And we always say that, in our conversations, is when was the last time media in general predicted an event, like which major event in the history of the past century, let's say, has been predicted and foreseen by the media, and you probably struggle to kind of give an answer or give an example. So the short answer is we saw a gap and we wanted to fill that gap. Then we can talk about the gap and what the nature of that gap that we want to fill.
Pressure?
Yeah. So I can pick up from the gap. I mean, one of the gaps that we saw is the need or the desire for long form journalism. And that was true when we launched the online, but it was also true when we launched the print, because we sort of envisioned readers wanting to literally curl up with a print magazine on the sofa or on the train without the distraction of the phone and social media and so on. And even our website has this philosophy where it's not crowded, nothing bombards you, there's no advertisement. And I mean, it's really frustrating. I'm at a point, sometimes I just want to quickly check online for news. I go to CNN.com or Reuters, and I can barely read a headline without something bombarding me. It's just really frustrating. So I think there was that gap, but even more importantly, I think the gap that we really do aim to fill, and I think we've been doing a pretty good job, is that when you're, like when we've been covering stories for the Middle East for international media, it's like very often, in my experience anyway, I felt that I've come across a pre-framing of the story. So, and it's very strong because the pre-framing has been the case for years or decades. And then anytime you pitch a story that's slightly outside that frame, or it's shifted, like the gaze is shifted or the frame is from a different angle, it just kind of gets turned down. Nobody gets it. The editors don't want it. So I think that's where New Lines comes in. We've been soliciting, commissioning, developing, editing, writing, and publishing these types of stories that that kind of break out of the frame. So and that's even embedded, that's cooked into the name of New Lines, is we're trying to shift the lines. And we see that's when we feel this story has been a success, when we publish a story and then we find everybody else doing the same story after us and it hadn't been done before us. And that's like, wow, we've shifted a line here, and we've shed light on something that was previously unseen. So yeah, so all that.
Okay, I'll pick up on the story. I remember doing a study for NYU for my thesis, and I did some surveys and I looked into Western media coverage of the Middle East and then the Middle East coverage of their own news. And it was very clear that, like the space given for Middle East coverage in Western publications was quite limited. And the story wasn't a story unless there's a war, a catastrophe, something big happened in the region that was extremely negative. So it just, people from the region were just painted with just one brushstroke that, they live in basically war and there's little culture there. There's nothing else worth covering than that. And ISIS, jihadists, whatever, these are the headlines you read. And it wasn't just the headlines, but, when I went out and asked people, when you read coverage about Middle East, what do you see? That's what they said, that we see negative coverage. And that's what we associate the Middle East with. And then when you look at the Middle East, and we all worked in the Middle East, and we all worked at Menashe, like we said, in the Gulf. And there's such rich culture in the region, but not a lot of it is being written about. There's still, you have red lines of things that you can say or you can't say, and you kind of, the lines move all the time, but you just, when you're a journalist in the region, you kind of don't know where is the red line. And even the top editors, they actually don't know themselves. And even government officials might actually be okay with what you're writing and what journalists are writing, but then you have heads of newspapers who are kind of just too scared that they would be either under attack, lose funding, the government would just not be happy with them, and then they would kind of like lecture you, like, why did you write this? And then somebody from the government would come out and say, no, actually, that was a good story. So you don't have the freedom to just do what you want, like, write the important stories. So I think that's the stories that we kind of seeking stories that you don't see out there, you won't read in Western media because they don't have the space, and also the length, because we as we tell writers, go as long as you want, just tell a good story and don't be repetitive. Yeah.
So when Hassan got in touch with me in 2020 to say that, we wanted to start this long form publication, I thought he had lost his marbles. I was like, I can't last for 5 minutes reading an essay or a book, or and readers are the same. One of the publications I worked for, we received an email one time saying, hey, stop writing stories that are longer than 600 words. It's like, because nobody's reading them, everybody's spending about 20 seconds on each story, and which is enough to read the first couple of paragraphs. Now try to explain the background of like the Turkish-Kurdish conflict in 400 words before actually getting to the news itself. You can't. But it turns out that the problem was not actually readers. It wasn't that readers were not reading those stories because they couldn't grasp mentally what you were trying to tell them, or because they were idiots, or because they just didn't have the time to sit and read your stories. It's because you were serving them content, for lack of a better word, that they didn't care about. They got their news from the headline everywhere, and that's all that mattered, and their world didn't end because of some minor development in a conflict halfway across the world. It turns out what readers want is long form, is stories that show them the deep tapestry of the societies that they're interested in reading about. It turns out that they actually want to sit and reflect and contemplate and learn something new from the media that they consume, almost kind of in a way sort of how they used to consume newspapers. And sit and read a long thing that will teach you something new about the world, and then move on with your life. And so I was wrong, and Hassan was actually right, as is very often the case in our many arguments and disagreements. But yeah, it's been a journey, and it's been a wonderful journey to see it start out from this small space where we're only doing 3 stories a week,
Yeah.
I think, and now it's up to 5 stories a week, and newsletters and all of that. So yeah, it's been magnificent, and it's been life affirming in a sense, because as a correspondent covering the region, I had some freedom in terms of determining what I would cover, even for a publication like The Guardian, that was interested in a broad variety of stories. But, you have 2-3 correspondents covering an entire region. And of course, what they're going to report on, gravitate towards, is the big geopolitical stuff, right? The wars, the suicide bombings, the coups and the deposed presidents. And it's very rarely, the stuff of everyday life that people from the region are actually familiar with and know.
Even in the region, if I may, decades ago, we used to have, even growing up, I used to hear and see people, even in rural areas, read these magazines that were produced in Kuwait, in the Gulf, really high caliber, Mujtama Arabi. These publications stopped publishing, but there used to be great enterprise reporting, in addition to kind of cultural pieces that delve into kind of really stories that you don't hear about. You have poetry sections and all kind of cultural stories and stuff like that. And it's kind of ironic, because that is where this kind of great content used to be produced, and now, because of the politics of recent years, because of the funding they have for publications like Jazeera, Arabiya and Saudi, Jazeera and Qatar, all the other publications in different places. Because of the polarization, each one was pulled into their own politics and polemics. We ended up having this, and that's actually an opportunity for us, because once we came out around the time when people sort of realized that Al Jazeera, which has done a great job in the region, opening up the space for the media in the 1990s and the early 2000s, and did a great job of coverage of the Iraq War and so on and so forth. And what happened with it after some people would say the Islamists took over and started to kind of have a more ideological and dogmatic coverage of the region. And then Al Arabiya came as an antidote to that, became the opposite of Al Jazeera, and it's a cultural war. It's almost like a Sunni Shia, but in the region. And that really caused a kind of rapid decline of the region media. So Western media, obviously we talk about it often, but actually always they do, especially when it comes to news, they cover news far better than anyone can do in the regions. But in the region, sort of that really became so toxic to be in the region, because you have to be either follow a certain line of political line, or write opinions and polemics and so on and so forth.
Yes, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because now I'm going to ask you a question I was planning to get into a little later, but you mentioned funding. You mentioned that Jazeera, Arabiya, sort of all essentially state-funded media in the Middle East. And I'm going to ask you a question that I got asked when we announced you. I got asked it a couple of times when we announced New Lines as a practitioner at the Working Center, which is who funds you. And I'm interested in this, and also in the context of beyond New Lines. And once you don't have advertising, you don't have a paywall. But also, I don't think, you're making news tonight. I think you don't accept any funding from regimes in the region, and especially the big three, which you touched on, the UAE, Saudi, and Qatar, which support so many media outlets, as many people here know, and also cultural projects in the region. And they also support projects like NYU's Abu Dhabi campus. The Big Working Center does not take money from NYU Abu Dhabi. So that's the context that's out there, and I'm sure you hear this question all the time of where your funding comes from, and the kind of attached question of independence.
Yeah.
Whoever
wants to take it. It's really, I mean, the answer is on the website review. So we have the publisher. We use our patron is the Iraqi American businessman, entrepreneur. You can trace down not just the funding, but how the money is made down to the hatching of the egg and the chicken. It's
it's actually true.
People complain in the team that I do a lot of bad jokes. So that is clear, but also I think it's related to it's connected to our origin story of New Lines, because we've had this idea for many years, and in 2019, when I started working with the current place that I work with, I sort of wanted to, I kind of already, especially in 2017 and 19, I kind of had a disillusionment with the think tanks, because that's when I started. I started as a journalist. I moved in 2016 to DC, started working with think tanks. And it took me just a couple of years to realize think tanks, the appeal of think tanks and the influence and the ability to actually do good work, it was just a false hope. And with Syria, I thought at the beginning we were actually doing good work of kind of informing policy. Anyway, so in 2019, I sort of wanted to go back to journalism again full-time, even though I continued to write for journalism publications. Anyway, so I proposed the idea of starting the magazine after sort of I wanted to leave the place where I wanted to work in, and eventually when that didn't seem to work, because there's always strings attached when it comes to funding. So I proposed that as a small product, as a trial within the place I was working on. That's kind of just, you publish 3 stories a week, You get funding around $300,000, it's been a small budget, and so on and so forth. And that was the kind of the beginning as a small product within the institution. The
And
fund
one was the think tank, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It
Think
was a
tank. So
It
we're
would
the
be a
think tank.
project of the think tank.
But I wanted to reach a point, kind of get to a point, which is that the current publisher said, you know, I'm not in the media business, but we can create this as a product, kind of just, you know, routine, kind of it's kind of retention policy and so on and so forth. So there was a side project within the think tank that was not meant to be a full, because it didn't really cohere or kind of align with the think tank work. It was kind of media work. Anyway, I think that after that it really grew so rapidly, the magazine, that started to make sense to the think tank and its mission and so on and so forth. And eventually it became a separate organization, where now the magazine has entirely different structure from the think tank, but also completely editorially independent. So 100% of the work is decided by people on this panel and the team from A to Z. And there's kind of, we follow also a decentralized approach, where if you're a South Asia editor, then you sort of have a lot of leeway of deciding what's good content, because the mission of the magazine is not to centrally control what's good content. The experts, the subject matter expert, has to be able to sort of dictate what's good content. And in that sense, I don't have control over the content, because of full control over the content. Kareem decides most of the Middle East coverage, Serbia, for example, South Asia coverage, and so on and so forth. So although obviously we have to agree on the pieces eventually. I don't know if that's
Others
kind of,
have, yeah, definitely that covers it, but I'm also interested if others have thoughts, especially on this issue, the related issue of the impact of essentially state funding for media, which has always been an issue, right? In the Middle East, a lot of them. Can you all hear me? But so beyond that's not a new. Hassan made this point, and I'm remembering also, right, Beirut in the 80s and 90s, and Cairo and anywhere. I mean, I guess unless you went to the Ba'athist regimes in Iraq and Syria, where they were much more controlled. But right, so the media, and you knew in general who was funding what, but you also had a lot of leeway, and a lot of what was being published was interesting, and you know, sort of push boundaries, push borders, even when it was being supported, you know, ultimately by Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein, or sort of, they probably didn't read and didn't realize what they were funding.
Yeah.
But now, but that seems to have closed in the last, and as this region got much more sectarianized, let's say, in the last 10 or 15 years, those avenues closed, and those places like Al Jazeera, a lot of the others, maybe the National, if you want to comment. I don't want to pick on Abu Dhabi too much, but you know, and they became instruments of those policies, of those government policies. So others, based on experience, based on just, if you want to share some thoughts on that and how that played out, and maybe something about, if you want to, you can or not connect it back to new lines, however you wish.
Yeah, I mean, I can mention one thing. So yeah, like when I worked at the National, there are some stories I expect, because it doesn't follow what the government wants to say. For example, there was I worked on a story about a stateless woman, and she had kids, and she was in the country in the UAE since before the formation, 1971. And she was basically in this limbo because her husband had died early on and hadn't gotten her the citizenship, and she wasn't able to get it, and so her kids didn't get it, and then they couldn't access education, couldn't access health, and then she was told to get a commerce passport to go to commerce embassy, and then but she, you know, you speak to her and that she speaks in such a heavy Morsi accent, she knows nothing except the UAE. And I wrote her story, and the story got spiked by the editors, and you never get told why. You just get told the powers that be said that, you know, this is not a story to cover. Years later, I was covering the UAE Parliament, and the speaker at the time, I think one of the members of the Parliament said, what are we going to do about stateless people? They wanted to propose it as a question on the floor. And then the speaker just stopped immediately and said, we don't have stateless people in the country. And that was just, he didn't do that normally. So it just felt like this is absolutely a red line. Do not even talk about it. So I think that's how we learn what are the red lines, because it's not like you go in and you're told, oh, this is what you can cover and this is what you can't cover. You kind of just left to your own devices to kind of figure out what you can and can't say. And so it's pretty tricky, because I mean that's the problem with being a journalist in the region, because you want to be a good journalist, you want to report important stories, but you just don't know if you're going to get into trouble for it, to be honest. Because also your editors are not entirely sure what they can and can't do. Honestly, I don't know about other places. I mean, I worked a little bit also in Jazeera English, and from my experience, the editors could pretty much publish whatever they want. I mean, I could publish whatever I want at the time. Like, it was a pretty easy CMS system. And there was a huge team. So I think it's, yeah, I don't know if anybody
That
else has
was the laws
experience.
in the US.
Yeah, that was
Was in local.
in BC.
Also, the readership is in English. and
Exactly,
It's
yeah.
a very different story with Al Jazeera in Arabic, because there's a lot at stake when the viewers are local,
Exactly. And then
from the perspective of the funders.
I do remember a lot of the time we would get frustrated, or like, the English department would get frustrated with what the Arabic section would write, because they were just so politically incorrect, so in every single way. And then they would bring them down, reputation wise.
I mean, I remember Al Jazeera, I mean, I'm sure we all remember this, and Barnard remembers this, sort of the years of Al Jazeera insisting on Iraq on calling them amaliyat istishhadi of any of what clearly there were suicide bombings meant to kill civilians, Iraqi civilians, and I don't even know if they ever changed the rhetoric around that.
So the record is like
Martyrdom operations, to call them that consistently for years, when it became clear, when it had turned into a civil war, and it turned into, and that was clearly a line that was, reflecting government line, but also just a general regional way in. But Karim,
So I didn't clear this answer with the embassy. I want to sort of answer the question, because they answered it so ably from the Middle East side of things, but I wanted to kind of talk about it a little bit from the on the ground. There were so many stories that were spiked for reasons that we weren't aware. I started covering politics in the National in 2009, and it was in 2010, and it was fairly straightforward to publish stories about the Iran sanctions, about the military, things like that. Up until the Arab Spring started, and then especially when Bahrain happened, that's when there was a lot of sensitivity, and I got the impression most of the time that the stories were getting spiked because the editors were self-censoring, as opposed to because they asked someone upstairs, as to what they should or shouldn't do.
In this case, it's literal upstairs.
Yeah.
Literally upstairs.
It's a hard newspaper upstairs from the National.
Yeah.
It was like the sister publication.
Yeah. But this sort of had an impact on Arab journalists who were reporting on the region more broadly, because the assumption by most Western publications that were hiring them to do work as stringers or as news assistants and so on, is that they were tainted somehow by the fact that media outlets were state-owned, and that journalism was essentially a form of stenography in a lot of parts of the region, because there wasn't really any critical reporting, even in the publications that were not directly owned by state institutions. This presented a problem, because a lot of Arab journalists found it very difficult to rise in the ranks a lot of these publications, and therefore to influence the coverage in some way, shape, or form. But I always found it fascinating to to discuss things from from the side of, it's really the Arab publications that do have a point of view, because I felt that the journalists or the news outlets reporting on the ground from the Middle East also had a point of view, and their journalists also had a point of view. It's ironic now that there's the whole, ruckus on social media over, Elon Musk labeling a lot of, government-owned publications, as government-owned, which they are, so, I mean, unless you have a different, maybe a different tick mark for autocratic government-owned publications versus democratic government-owned publications. But it doesn't come across from the funding perspective. It often comes across from things like the journalists in, let's say Istanbul, for example, choosing primarily to live in places that are, Western oriented, where people are liberal, where people are kind of similar to them or like them. As opposed to having a social milieu that includes people that they disagree with or that are very different, to who they are, in their home countries, right? And this is something that influences one's coverage too. You go to this is why you see so many stories in the run-up to Turkish elections saying, "Oh, this might be the one time like Erdogan loses." And then he doesn't, right? And it's because there's a difference in perspective that's influenced by the type of people you as a journalist choose to hang out with or choose to spend time with, and that influences your perspective as to what is happening, as to what the news is, as to whether something is right or wrong. And that influences your perspective as well. Beyond the sort of the money that goes to that goes directly from the state into the coffers of that particular newspaper. And it's really important to think of that as well when you're a news consumer. It's not just that, okay, the state is paying for, Al Jazeera or for Al Arabiya or for whatever, and that, means that you cannot read Qatar news from, Al Jazeera because it's not going to be reliable. But it's also worth keeping in mind, those aspects when you're consuming Western media outlets as well. And the way we try to sort of deal with this is we don't just commission foreign correspondents or foreign correspondent types or local reporter types or just academics. Like we actually try to commission lots of different perspectives in that sense. As long as you are somebody with an expertise in a particular part of the world, in a particular country, we're going to ask you to write it, to write a piece for us, or, we'll commission you if you have a good story idea, independently of where you're from, or, whether you're a foreign correspondent or you're somebody who's been reporting, from that particular country as a local, or you're an academic expert who spent a lot of time studying this place. We try and cast a wide net in that sense, so we can overcome the biases that exist, whether it's from state-owned media or from individual mindsets and perspectives.
Thank you.
Yeah, and if I may add, actually, this is also a question on everybody's mind, everybody being, the journalists and everybody in journalism, with regards to funding and business models for journalism and media outlets here. Since journalism has been in something of a I'll raise my voice, since journalism has been in something of a crisis. So what's a good model for journalism? What's a good model to fund media outlets that really do serve the public good? It's for profit, and we know all the problems with that. They always somehow go bust because they're not making enough profit. I think it seems that nonprofit is, a viable, somewhat sustainable way of doing journalism. And I mean, if you think about it, with all the impact that we're doing at New Lines, we're only 2.5 years old. We're a small team. We're barely just getting started. And this is all because stars aligned. And actually, Hassan gets a lot of the credit, and I'll let hear those two. But the stars aligned.
For the Romans, yeah, it's truly teamwork, because each one have as their referred to.
Yeah, but before the team even, the stars aligned for the funding to be there, and it just happens to be, you know, one philanthropist with the right state of mind. And it's unfortunate that this is how good journalism can happen. I mean, there needs to be more of that. It shouldn't be just that. And hopefully, I don't know, I mean, hopefully journalism, it evolves and finds more ways to kind of, you know, keep serving the public good, but
Especially that people, philanthropists and others do have money and they spend it on, you know,
on
Useless-
rockets,
useless
yeah,
projects.
and spend it on
in, you
rockets.
know, in DC and elsewhere, it's like millions and millions and millions of dollars for like silly stuff like meetings and so on.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's, yeah, I've seen it. I've seen people with a budget of 30 million doing nothing.
Yeah,
Well, and
So the money is there. It's just really people kind of understand what media can do. The problem is there have been over the past, say, 5, 6, 7 years, lots of projects, startups from the Middle East and elsewhere. For the Middle East, because we're talking about the Middle East, that tried to do something like media startups and they spend lots and lots of money. They have huge budgets, but they don't, you know, they never resonated because so many different reasons. So there are people there, there are money there. There's money.
Yeah, I'm gonna speed through, I just got my signal, I'm gonna speed through the rest of my questions, because I wanna leave a lot of time for questions from the audience. I think they'll have a lot. But I'm gonna ask you this question, probably because I think it represents something about what you're all trying to do with New Line. And this is, you used to be a war correspondent, you covered lots of things in the region, but you covered the early years of the Syrian uprising. You lived undercover in Damascus, and you worked for NPR and Reuters then, and possibly other places. And then, so for New Lines, you're part of the editorial team, but also you've written a lot of first-person pieces and memoir pieces about that time. And then you've written, I think we heard in the workshop that some of the most popular pieces you've written have been pieces about sci-fi as a literary genre in the Arab world, which is not something you read about a lot in English language. You don't even read about it that much in Arabic, actually. And so, I mean, you have to find very specific things to find it. And I guess if you can share with us some thoughts on how does this fit together? How does that, your own background, your own experience in the region, and in pursuing these interests and writing about these interests, I guess in trying to cultivate an audience for these interests, how does it, you know, your own role as a journalist, writer about the region, but also being part of this publication?
yeah, I mean, first of all, just correcting the record, yeah, the sci-fi science fiction in the Arab world story was a big hit. But my favorite was the story that I wrote about my cats.
Oh,
But that's a whole.
That's just gonna break all of you. We're not gonna even talk about it.
Okay.
That's,
We
yeah.
almost read the rest of
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
So, and just to basically to what you said, I often say everything I ever learned or needed to learn or needed to know, I learned from journalism and from being a journalist. And honestly, because just having curiosity, following the lead, following the sort of curious thread, oh, what's going on there? Let me go check it out. And also doing something that I think everybody in DC does not do, except journalists. And that's like literally just sitting there and thinking. As opposed to getting out of your head and, you know, rolling up your sleeves and diving into a story, like diving into someone else's thoughts, or whatever is going on here and there. So, you know, and I think that, I mean, that's one thing you're always going to miss as an editor, and I do miss it sometimes or often even, is just being in the field and writing and reporting, because that's really the fun stuff of journalism. But, you know, but sort of to answer your, sort of to follow your train of thought, you know, nothing is off the table, and it shouldn't be. I mean, I covered war, but I don't want to always be writing or editing war. And the one thing that we all cover as journalists, everybody, no matter what our beat is humanity in from every direction, whether it's science and technology or business or war or, you know, or whatever, culture and arts. That's what we're covering. And you know, that's basically what I try to develop in the stories that I commission, or when I'm editing stories, that's what I want to bring into the story. The you know, the gravitas of the humanity in it, and why it matters to a human, even if it's about cats, for cats, but it still matters to humans. So
4 cats?
Yeah.
4 cats?
Russia actually tests all her cat sitters now by making them read that essay.
Uh,
And
Yeah.
the responsibility they have to take on.
that's true. That's true. Before I hire a cat sitter, they have to read what I've written about my famous cats.
How come there's no podcast for the cats yet?
We're thinking about making them the mascots.
And there was an NPR did do a podcast about it, and about my cats.
Okay, to take us slightly in a different direction, I'm sure we'll come back to the cats in the audience. And I guess, so. But I thought about framing this question in a way, so. We can talk about the global approach you've taken, especially I guess in the last year, but since we're at the Middle East Center of NYU, and I think you hear this question often, and I'm trying to ask it not in a stereotypical way, but I'll ask it because I think it's important to hear your thinking on this, and that's if you have, does New Lines have an approach or lens to covering the region, right? And I imagine, and I've seen that you've been accused of supporting the uprising, but supporting the uprisings uncritically since 2011. But I mean, in existence since then, but in the kind of retrospect.
Before New Lines.
Yeah, yeah, but also before you existed, yeah, of course, but that's the criticism is never necessarily rooted in reality. And also you've gotten criticism, right, for publishing US officials on the region, former US officials, and here I'm thinking about Fred Hoff and Robert Ford. I mean, both excellent diplomats in different ways. For those of you who don't know, Fred Hoff was a long time US diplomat who in the late 90s and early 2000s did a lot of work on and almost got Syria and Israel to agree to a peace deal over the Golan, and other things he tried to. He did a lot of the framework for the eventual maritime deal between Israel and Lebanon. Someone has a lot of experience in the region, and ended up, I think, in the very end of his career, before he broke with the Obama administration, was the special representative, U.S. envoy to the Syrian opposition. And Robert Ford was the last Syrian, had been ambassador to Iraq, and also was the last U.S. ambassador to serve in Syria before Damascus broke off relations. So I think, and they've written interesting pieces they've written, but from their perspective. And so I guess, how do you tackle that question of, in the end, you're making decisions about who to publish, right? And you're making decisions about how to approach, I mean, you're thinking, I imagine you have editorial meetings regularly. I mean, these are all the things that every news organization, every outlet deals with. And it opens you up to that criticism, and also your own sort of your own experiences that you're bringing in. I mean, as journalists, everyone is bringing in their background and context into all of that. Anyone who wants to take that question.
I mean, I personally was not aware of that specific criticism, but I will tell you that we're always just, getting feedback, positive and negative, and criticism and accusations and smears and applause and, everything you would expect as a journalist. And we don't have an ombudsman on our team, but we take every little tiny piece of accusation or criticism very, very seriously. I mean, immediately we're on it. Like, did you see this tweet? What's going on? Oh, who is this person? Oh, do they have a point? Oh, let me just read that again. And I mean, I don't know. In the end, I always tell people, who are also what I get sometimes in person is this like suspicion. Yeah, but what's really your agenda? What is like, why did you launch new lines? Really? And I'm like, listen, you don't have to, guess and scratch your head and ask me all these questions. I mean, just read the content, and I'm sure if there's an agenda, you'll see it. Nobody can hide their agenda from what they publish. It just speaks for itself. And if this piece, might trigger criticism that it's too pro-uprising, I guarantee you another piece we publish will trigger the opposite criticism. And that's just the business of journalism. It's just what happens. If the criticism is consistent and it echoes and it continues to criticize from the same perspective, then you start to have a problem. Then, there is something that you're doing wrong. But I mean, as far as I know, unless I'm missing something, the criticism is disparate and it's sort of across the spectrum. And very often, I would love to hear really, constructive, rich criticism, but very often it comes just kind of in a tweet from someone who hasn't read the piece or something like that. It's just.
Or it comes or it's ideological, and someone was sort of like,
Oh yeah, absolutely. Or it's ideological. Someone's upset that something just doesn't agree with them ideologically or whatever. Or it's a smear, or it comes in all shapes and sizes.
Yeah, and just some of these stories as well, like they were good because there were first-person pieces that no one else could tell the story of negotiations that weren't in the room, but the actual person who had the negotiations. So I think that's what we wanted to bring out, and I think some of them were never told before, those stories. Right, or like the Tale of Two Syrians. I think that was the first time it was published. That story.
Yeah.
Even though those same diplomats or prolific writers, they write a lot. But one thing we usually try to kind of get people to write their story for the first time.
Yeah.
But also people who write a lot to write a story that they never told.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's also another thing we're trying to do.
And also, we sort of err on the side of like having more perspectives, right? And I think that that's the right way to go about things. The problem with, the example of like, the Iraq War is that in the run-up, there was this, drumbeat that, even the liberal publications that, ostensibly became anti-war after the war started, they carried on, portraying the words of US officials as gospel, right? Now, we will publish an anonymous US official saying, this is how the negotiations between Syria and Israel went. But we'll have like the first person piece, the person who was there during a historic moment in regional history, that didn't pan out, actually tell us what happened. And the reality is that this would be, this would be a problem if. We were primarily publishing US officials about the region, not naming names, but most Western publications that report on the region are quoting US officials, right? But we give them a place to be able to, tell the story if they were part of a historic event like that. But they're not the only perspective, and we are on the side of having, people who have expertise and who have something insightful and interesting and new to tell. One good example, is the example of the Hamlin University controversy, which, by the way, we broke. in December, and then it became a.
So I didn't hear it. Can you say it again?
We covered the story first, then the Times did, and then it became, you know, a national story in the US. But, you know, we had one of those really long editorial conversations about, you know, how do we do this piece, and do we publish the you know, the painting in question, or do we not? And we end up doing it, you know, after, you know, we had disagreements over it and so on. But, you know, you'll notice the person who wrote the piece for us, you know, was not, you know, a cleric or you know, or just we had to get somebody from the Middle East to write it. It was actually an American professor of Islamic art history. And she presented the perspective that showing this painting in class was not offensive, because in fact, for centuries, Islamic artists, you know, portrayed the image of the Prophet Muhammad as a form of reverence, right? Now, if the story had been what it usually is, the way these stories are usually covered, it's always, oh, you know, the students got offended because, you know, they're students, and and you know, and you know, and this is like the most Muslims and Arabs, you know, hate portrayals of the Prophet Muhammad because they think it's sinful, and the university's perspective, and that they apologized, and you know, they got scared and all of that. Now, you know, the professor, you know, an American professor, presented a very unique perspective that actually advanced the conversation, and made it a whole different question of, okay, well, hold on a second, we keep having all these arguments about whether it's offensive to portray the prophet or not, but you know, actually, let's go back and see the tradition of these portrayals. You know, was it always a problem, or is this current obsession a fundamentalist viewpoint that is not only contrary to free expression, but is contrary to Islamic tradition, right? And this is a perspective that could have only been presented by somebody who was an expert, who was a learned individual, who was familiar both with Islamic art and its history, but also with, you know, the current debates that are happening right now. And so this multiplicity of perspectives is something that not only is the right thing to do, because, you know, we're a publication that believes in free expression and in giving everybody a platform to say what they think, you know, within the bounds of reason, obviously, but also because it advances the conversation, because we all learn something new from it.
Yeah. And also to add to that, usually the problem, and this is something we go into during that conversation, is when polarization happens, division and polarization creates a new language of resistance that makes it harder next time for people to raise the question again. So when the paintings in Norway and, you know, in Europe happened, and those paintings were offensive to Muslims, they were portraying, they were insulting, right, for Muslims, and people got angry because it wasn't because they were paintings, but because they were insulting.
Yeah, it's the cartoon.
The cartoons,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So what happened was, eventually, when the polarization happened and the violence happened, the protests, all this happened, we created a situation where next time someone says Muhammad paintings picture, that's bad immediately, right?
Yeah.
So that's why, for example, lots of publications, without exception, refuse to put the paintings drawn by Muslims in the 13th, 17th century, whatever, in the piece, because they were afraid, because they were informed by the old debate, by the old polarization. Whereas we said, no, we're going to open this to discussion from the get-go. Is this offensive? Why is it offensive? And who is going to be offended by it? Nobody. And then we decided we're going to put it online. We published a piece with the paintings, and not a single, probably with maybe one or two exceptions, mainstream publication ran the pictures because they were afraid of the old ghost, essentially, of that old debate. But
also, not a single, we did not receive a single email or tweet or anything of anyone expressing offense that we had done that.
Exactly.
And I think it also goes to show that, you know, we were in a position, I mean, with all fairness, we were in a position where, you know, we have the sort of cultural gravitas to do this. Nobody can question our cultural expertise when it comes to this, but we also made the choice to be brave, to be honest. And I think, you know, it worked it worked out really well for our readers and for the narrative, the public conversation, which we feel we set, you know, we kind of, or we reset it. If we hadn't published that piece along with the image, I think, you know, like the Times and the big media, had they gone on to do the story, I think they would have done the story in the good old way. Basically, oh, the student association says this, the teacher says that,
We don't want to
truth
hurt
is
this-
somewhere in
we
between.
don't want to hurt the students.
End of story. Yes, exactly. Whereas we just we did a complete reset to the public conversation. And then, you know, everything that happens after that is, you know,
Shift in the mind.
yeah, I mean, we really did shift the line.
I wanted to also go back to your question, because that was a very good question. I think maybe we haven't sufficiently responded to the story about people accusing us of being supportive of uprising. As Russia said, I haven't heard that criticism, so nobody actually told us, you guys, you know, but I sensed that before we started that because, you know, we're assembling team, we have like people from the region, and some of us have had strong opinions about that. And that actually was embedded in the mission and the structures and the way we operate the magazine from the beginnings. How do we prevent? So this is a tricky one to say personally, because I'm Syrian, but I grapple with the question of what my opinions, how my opinions, not that they matter, but how they, my opinions contributed to the problems and disaster and everything that happened in Syria. Because, you know, you're responsible for what you say, even if it wasn't really the maker of what happened, but you feel guilty that maybe we were naive in the way we approach these things, and maybe, you know, not me, obviously, again, but, you know, we were way part of this wave, right? And it happened at the time when I was grappling with this, and that's why, for example, I didn't want to make the opposite, the reverse problem, the reverse thing, which many intellectuals, not like professors, academics who do this kind of work, they witness, for example, things that happened in Iraq or before, and they continue to fight the same fight because they were disillusioned with something, and they take the opposite offensive, going against the demands of popular demands. So I didn't want to, on a personal level, again, I'm not elevating myself to any status. I'm just saying that my own thinking is I didn't want to do the opposite of start speaking against these movements that they're naive and so on. So the best thing for me is to stay silent on kind of, even on Twitter, I became a lot more, you know, quiet. I don't even comment on anything because I became agnostic to what's happening in the region. So part of the mission of New Lines, or part of the way we do New Lines is both structurally and on a personal level, is we don't do predetermination of what the line is, what the ideology is. And that's why from the beginning, we said 3 things are no for New Lines: no activism, no ideology, and no op-eds and polemics and commentary. So we eliminated these things as measures and checks and balances on ourselves, not to run opinions. And, you know, so if you want to write for us, you can write your story or your idea rather than your opinion. And that's something we innovated on, like we eliminated the op-ed section, because I think, to me, the problem with the New York Times, Washington Post, and the crisis of journalism in general, I'm speaking about this, you know, we look up for like these publications that we learned everything from. Their problem is not the news sections or the other sections, it's the opinion section. So if you want to, you know, pick who the people are angry about in the US, they would point out to this pundit and that pundit, not this journalist or reporter and this other journalist or reporter. It's the opinionated and the polemicist. So to me, I claim that we have innovated on that level in a way that we prevent straightforward commentary from us, and that was a way to minimize, at least, or mitigate the problem you're talking about.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. I have a lot of other questions, but I'm going to open it up because we have about 25 minutes. If there's a lot, and
I am, not one of the founding editors or any editor, but I would like to say that I'm one of the founding fans. And
That's true.
from the beginning, there was like a special sauce to New Lines, where it seemed like every article that you posted 3 times a week, I wanted to tweet it, and I probably did tweet like literally all of your articles. And I'm trying, I think it would be so interesting if you guys could try to define what is that je ne sais quoi, because like for me, there's 3 kinds of New Lines articles. There's ones that like I wish I wrote because like I meant to write them, and then there's ones that like I've been hoping someone would write this, but it's not something I could write. And then the third kind is my favorite, which is the ones that are like, I didn't know this topic existed, but now that I see it, I'm like, I want to read that. And I've been trying, while you've been talking, I've been making notes to myself, like, okay, it's eclectic, but it somehow hangs together. Hassan and I have talked a lot about how you reverse the gaze. You're talking about, you're not writing from a perspective that Washington is the center and the Middle East is the periphery. You're not really saying that the Middle East is the center either. You're like multi-central, and like what I love is sometimes there's articles that are about like, I don't know, just to make one up, like, Ugandan music in Ukraine or something, something that's about 2 countries that are neither the Middle East nor the West. And then lately I've seen you use a slogan that says like a local newspaper for the world,
Yeah.
or something like this.
Yeah.
And maybe that's where it sort of hangs together, but still, because a lot of, I'm a person who spent my career alternating between doing local journalism and international journalism, and even local journalism in other countries sometimes. The Moscow Times was my first newspaper. And not everyone gets that right when they say we're going to write this local thing, but in such a way it's going to ring true to the local person, but it's also going to be something that someone else would want to read. That's much easier said than done. Maybe Karim can start, because I first knew you as an absolutely indefatigable, wonderful reporter for the Beirut Daily Star.
Rest in peace. Never forget.
And maybe like, is there something about mixing local and international, or like, I'd love to hear what you each think is that special sauce. And I'm guessing it's not something you decided on, it's something that evolved. Maybe you just all have great taste, I don't know.
Before Karim starts answering, Anna's too modest to introduce herself. Anne Barnard is a longtime Middle East correspondent for the Boston Globe, and most recently at the New York Times, where she was the Syria and Lebanon bureau chief. Through a lot of
We're big fans of you.
Yeah, we are. Yes.
Betty.
I mean, maybe we should come up with like a New Lines headline meme, the headline generator, Ugandan music in Ukraine. I think it's honestly a mix of all the things that you said. I mean, I'm not as literary as the other members of the team who I appreciate as really incredible thinkers and as people of actual great taste. I am not, but it's difficult. It's often difficult to kind of crystallize it in that way, because, like you said, it did evolve over time. Initially it was just a question of why hasn't anybody written about this before? And here's where I think some of the credit needs to go to the writers who approach us with a lot of story ideas. There's a lot of situations where we have conversations and we say, okay, we want to do this story. Why hasn't anyone ever written about this particular thing? Or we'll be kind of having a back and forth discussion or argument about something, and it coalesces into an idea. And this is something you don't really see a lot in newsrooms, because they're so top down in terms of how they commission stories, or how they ask writers to pursue them, because the question is always what is the big story that's happening around the world, right? And we can afford not to approach things from that perspective. We can afford to just say, oh, well, what is let's talk about this, let's interrogate this particular question that popped up randomly during one of our conversations about well, does Islam really prohibit having dogs in your house? you know, and then, you know, we try to have like these conversations, well, where does it go back to, you know, and then you know, it oftentimes leads to a bigger question of, you know, how orthodoxy, you know, how religious orthodoxy kind of gets passed down. You know, what is the question, you know, why are the beliefs that we have today about about how we're, you know, we're supposed to behave as Muslims or as Arabs or as Westerners or as Americans or as whatever, why are they the way they are, right? How did they come to be, you know, the way they are right now? And I think this, you know, these sort of like water cooler conversations are absolutely essential and integral to coming to interesting questions, right? And once you get to the interesting question, then you can, you know, start interrogating further and finding the right writer, having those conversations with them. Very oftentimes the writers, you know, they kind of have this sense that, and you know, when we have good writers that we work with a lot, you know, I'll often tell them, you know, that story that you've been, you know, obsessing about, but there's zero chance anyone is going to publish it. You should come to us because we're probably going to publish it. And I've come to realize that I
Living the dream.
exactly right. I've come to recognize that I recognize those stories because I'll start you know, reading the first couple of paragraphs, and then I'll start randomly quoting really interesting things to, like, you know, the editor's chat that we have on Teams. I'm like, oh my god, like this story is
We have nothing to do.
yeah. But yeah, it is that, you know, the special sauce in a sense, you know, is okay. Well, we're not obsessed with kind of covering the news day to day, right? And so people who are obsessed with their part of the world, you know, who live in that part of the world because they care about it, because they love it, because they find it absolutely fascinating, and because they're truly engaged with the tapestry that makes it tick, they come to us and they say, hey, I've got a really cool story.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, the secret sauce, it goes both ways. I mean, there are a lot of stories out there, and there are actually a lot of storytellers. But very often a lot of the media outlets, they don't accept freelance pitches, or if they do, it's very rare and it has to fit the sort of, you know, an already pre-established frame. But we're like, hey, just, you know, send us pitches. And we also come up with ideas to commission. So we're bouncing ideas, and we're like, oh, let's find someone who can do a story on this, because I haven't seen that done anywhere. So it goes both ways.
I think also, like, people don't realize like how some stories take months and months of us nagging the person to write their story. Like, Hassan spent years to tell Ali Barouji to write his piece from Iraq, and that was a great piece. And he was a photojournalist, and yeah, he wrote 2 brilliant pieces from there about, you know, as an Iraqi, like living there and so on, and under ISIS and stuff. So there's that, just nagging.
Yeah, that's one of the things we're proud of is
The nagging.
we discover new writers, and sometimes it takes a lot of effort. It's not easy. It's becoming actually difficult because now we're stretched thin, and one of the things we're trying to do is let's go back to, I mean, we're still doing it, but like, let's go back to do more of that original way of doing things, where you go into the person and you, instead of the writer coming to convince you as an editor, you're trying to convince the writer to write a story, but you know a specific person, and that depends. That's why, for example, every editor has a lot of leeway, because unless they're wrong, because they're subject matter experts on the subject. So, you know, if you're an Iraqi, you know who's the best to write about that specific topic.
Yeah.
So you have to, the bona fides, as Russia likes to, you know, what's the bona fides for this person, why this person writes this piece. Instead of, because the problem, again, for generally the media, is that this weird relationship between think tanks and like pundits on one hand and media. So a journalist has to quote an expert, and there's a relationship that exists there. So what ends up happening, because of the not because the system is wrong, but because maybe the speed. So if you have a story that you have to file today, you just got a scoop or a story, and you need a quote from 2 experts. You have 1 hour to deliver that quote. So who's your pick? Not the best in the business, but who picks the picks up the phone faster, right? In Dubai, we used to quote one person. Every person in the newsroom knows that at 5 o'clock, that's the only person who picks up the phone. So we call him to give us a quote, right? And that ends up being an expert on anything from Al Qaeda to ISIS to coronavirus to chemical weapons. It's the same person, right? Whereas we try to say, we don't need these quotes. We cut the middleman, essentially, go straight to the source and get that person that you're quoting for another story, for example, is interested to write that story. I think that's kind of one. We talked about this for some months.
Hassan, you're too diplomatic to say that the journalists and writers are sometimes have a lot more expertise than the experts. Not always.
Yeah.
Well, at the very least, you're sitting there, you're like in Beirut, you're reporting on what's happening in Syria. And then you go quote somebody who was in DC or New York, and as I mean, when I first started at the Guardian, this is basically the same behavior I took on until Martin Chulak was the senior correspondent there. He asked me, he's like, "Why are you calling this person?" So you're supposed to have three like experts, like 3 sources in every story. It's like you probably know more than this person, and so why are you quoting them?
Yes. Okay, I want to see a show of hands. I want to try to get as many questions as I can get in. So I'm going to see who's interested in asking. Raise your hands a little higher so I can see. Okay, I'm going to go there. And then we'll come back to Ilana. And then, yes, go there first. I might take a couple of questions at a time. So do your question first, and then we'll do Ilana after.
Hi, well,
We can hear you.
I think it's for the recording, because I'm not doing the work.
It's okay.
So speaking of secret sauce, I mean, when I go to New Lines, it's often for the storytelling and the historical background on a specific topic. But I also feel there is pieces that would keep me thinking after reading, and I always relate this to critical theory courses in academic settings, and it seems New Lines is this like pairing between journalism and theory. So I was wondering if there was an intentional academic thread behind the formation of the journal.
But we're gonna take Ilana.
Hi, first of all, hi, I'm so happy to meet you all in person. Thank you for accepting my pitch, and I'm excited to publish with you. But I guess my question is about, we're in a really interesting time of upheaval in traditional media right now, and I think that New Lines is speaking into kind of a little bit of that shift and change. And I'm curious what you see are the challenges and opportunities of this moment, and how New Lines is thinking about moving and using this moment to transition into the future of media and what the future of media journalism looks like from your perspective.
So,
The academic.
the academic, there's absolutely a push on our end. I mean, we love academics. We don't love how they write usually, but we don't love their perception of deadlines, because they think they'll be like, yeah, sure, happy to write a piece for you. I can file it in spring of 2025. And and that's totally normal for them. And then sometimes they file stories and it's all in academies. And my favorite thing when I edit their stories is, if I had to look it up in the dictionary, then no go. So because the reader is going to have to look it up in the dictionary. And sometimes they bury the lead. And anyway, they have, they just write very differently, and they need a lot of restructuring on our end. But it's really important, I think, to bridge that gap between academics and writing for the general public, because so much so much on the cutting edge research, thoughts, whatever is produced in academia, and very often it stays within the ivory tower, and that's just not right. And I do think it is the the duty of journalism to help what's the word, birth those ideas into the general domain, translate them, I don't know, how midwife them, you know, sort of doula them, you know, bring them out into the world so that they're not stuck in the ivory tower. So yeah, I'm really happy to hear that you're picking up on that sort of academic, you know.
And it's
Right.
embedded in our mission that we want our content to be rigorous. It's all about.
Yeah. And fresh and cutting edge and new ideas.
Yeah, bring that to the public.
Yeah. It's how you shift lines in the public conversation.
Okay, that second question, who wants to take a piece of that?
The future of social media.
So I think it's even broader, media, it's like the easiest question.
I mean, I can start, but it's really just kind of the question of how sick people are of social media, really, and how they're really tired of this cycle of outrage and argument, and I think people are coming to the realization that Twitter is not real life. You know? Nobody talks like that in person. But it's a broader point, which is that people are smarter than we give them credit for, I think, in the media, and they're, you know, those who are polarized because they're so obsessed with, you know, the algorithms that show you the thing that's going to piss you off the most, you know, and showing that to you in your feed. Whereas in reality, most people actually really want to interact with the world in a way that goes beyond, you know, this is what I'm angry about today. And people really want to sit down with a piece and truly absorb it and think about it and read it. You know, we send long form stories like on our newsletters, right? And they have like a 40% open rate, which is nuts for an email newsletter. They're you know, 1,500 to 2,000 words, and people are actually opening their emails to sit and read through all of it. They're reading the website, you know, they're reading those essays that are 2,500 words and longer, you know, and they're spending the time to sit and read them. Readers are, on average, are not the readers who's, you know, have the attention span of a gnat, you know, they can't go through more than 2 paragraphs without glazing over and scrolling on to the next.
Do you know, or can you share your time per page?
So I haven't checked it in a long time, but it really depends on the story. But I do remember when I first looked at Google Analytics in our first weeks, and I saw that people were spending 15 to 20 minutes on a single article. That was the average. And that kind of really shocked me. And shocked all of us, because we really honestly, like, I mean, like Kareem said, we all started kind of like, yeah, sure, but like we're like, oh, I don't know if this is gonna work. Like, people are gonna sit for so long. Some articles people stay on for an hour reading it.
And usually it's under a minute. I mean, for a lot of websites, it's under a minute that people stay on the page.
I mean, I was in places where they told us like cut stories from 600 words to 400 words.
Yeah.
And Kareem as well, and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. People just really want to sit down and actually learn something new about the world, and then go on with their day, you know,
Yeah.
meet their friends and talk to them maybe about the story,
Yeah.
maybe about life, maybe interact with individuals on a, you know, personal level. It's just scary, but you know, people, that's how they want to consume news now, and I mean, at least this is what we've found, that how they want to consume stories with us, you know. And I think just approaching that perspective alone, approaching readers with the idea that they are more intelligent than we give them credit for. And then exploring ways to be able to tell the long form story. You know, I was at a conference last week in Italy, and you know, there was someone who was presenting this idea that, you know, they were also a long form website, but I think they were German, and you know, they decided to experiment with audio. And now 85% of the content they have is audio, because people are super keen to listen to stories in different ways. You know, they listen to the story for a while, then they read it. You know, when they're on the bus, they want to listen to it. When they're, you know, at their office, or like, you know, having breakfast or whatever, they want to read it. And you know, we're playing around with a lot of different you know, content formats. You know, we're experimenting with audio ourselves. You know, we've got really successful podcasts that have been, you know, nominated for awards too.
Started animation
Animation.
videos. Yeah.
And I do hope that this, the success we're finding with the long form is actually a proof of concept for other media outlets, because I want to see competition. I want to see other media outlets that are emulating our model or advancing upon it. I mean, this is why we're in journalism. It's the public service for this kind of thing.
The AI feature as well, that
Yeah.
we're exploring.
Yes, the AI is coming. We'll see what
Yeah.
that does. Yeah.
There's-
So AI is definitely solving the Middle East problems.
Yeah.
Sure.
It's one thing we haven't tried, so.
Yeah. Everyone else, okay, I see two questions in the back, let's take those together, we have about 4 or 5 minutes.
Right, thank you very much. This is a quick two-part question. One is related to, I'm curious to know if there was really a precise kind of political context in terms of coverage. Not that made you want to, not in an editorial sense that made you take an editorial line, but kind of made you notice the lack of context, which I think is something that's very important. I mean, I can relate to the idea that there's so much context that needs to be said before you say something, and how devoid of context Western media is, regardless of what editorial line. And I'm thinking, I mean, was it the Arab uprising to some extent that made us realize that the lack, because in order to understand each country's struggle, no matter what stand you take, there's a tremendous amount of context that needs to be understood per country, or per even local micro locality. And that was so sorely lacking. And so I'm wondering the general political context that made you notice some of the shortcomings of Western media.
Yeah.
And then I think going into the Arab Spring thing, I mean, since the Arab uprising, there has been a kind of birth of media in Arabic. Obviously taking a more activist pro stance, kind of more activist stance, things like Megaphone or Madam Masar or Jamhuriya, and then also podcasts as well. And that leads me to my second question, which is about languages. Speaking of decentering, is New Lines interested in, or is there some kind of reckoning with publishing in not in English, publishing in other languages like Arabic, even covering America in Arabic?
Right.
You know, so finally, speaking of this idea of decentering coverage.
Thank you, and there's one more question in that row as well. Oh, sorry, it's not, there's it.
I was gonna ask the question about publishing in Arabic.
Oh.
And the reason for that question is that, the same way there is a kind of a disillusionment or mistrust about Western media and like the lack of trust of the public trust in Western media. I think it's fair to say that Arabs as well have a lack of trust to their media as well. Right. And that kind of prompts the way for new attempts to address that that gap or that lack of trust. And I'm wondering of your experience with it, is that do you think that there is I would say a chance for a more nuanced media in the Arab world, given the restrictions? Maybe not stemming from inside the Arab world, given the reasons that we all know, but from outside the Arab world, commenting on it with a little bit more of a kind of, let's say, human outlook towards it, rather than a very simplistic or a very what do they call it? Without ideological.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you.
thank you for, there are basically now 3 excellent questions. Where we just got past 7 o'clock, but we can do 5 minutes. I think we can take these, and I know they're all long form, but we can take these and.
So for
Arabic publishing.
Arabic in one word, we don't intend to do an Arabic kind of new lines, but there might be an idea adjacent to New Lines, because New Lines is not like an Arab publication, it's not a Middle Eastern publication, it's for different parts of the world, even though the focus is the Middle East, the focus is South Asia, the focus is Africa, so each region is the focus in that sense. So we don't want to kind of, if you start just Arabic, kind of plays with the brand. In terms of, but I have been in discussion talking about this idea of Arabic, and it's such a fascinating question, because when you start thinking about it, the whole industry is completely different. The Arabic media if you go to the past, like again, past three, 4 decades, all the organizations produced in Arabic are almost the same. They do news, and usually even the coverage of news is very specific, influenced by what everyone else is talking about. So that kind of enterprise reporting, in one word, doesn't exist in the region. People even talk about investigative work, but if you broke what they mean by investigative work, it really means feature, not really investigative. They don't understand, not the people, but like the way the media structure, they don't understand what the investigative work is, or what, blah, blah, all this kind of things. So there's a huge gap there, and if someone can really take that and create something authentic, something real, organic in the region that addresses these problems at the same time. So it's not just cut and paste Western, like a Western style newspaper and bring it to the region, like we tried to do with the National back in the day, or the New York Times of the Middle East, and all we did is copy the New York Times, or trying to, and just didn't, it wasn't really close to the New York Times or to a local magazine, newspaper. So I'm sure.
Yeah, and when it comes to context, of course, I mean, I think that makes or breaks the story. And I'd like to add, it's not just, oh, Western media lacked context when covering the Middle East. I mean, media in general has trouble with context because very often the reporters, the editorial staff is not diverse enough, for example. I mean, part of the crisis in journalism here is that journalists are not poor. Usually journalists come from middle class or upper middle class, and usually they're centered on the East Coast or West Coast, usually in urban areas. Okay, well, is it any surprise that everybody missed the Trump election and that Trump was going to, win the election? And so what have we learned now is covering America by US-based media very often lacks context because there aren't enough reporters on the ground where it really matters. So yeah, context is everything, but it's very difficult to, bring it in.
Not only that, just like, such small things can be made, like changed and altered and edited into mistakes. Like I remember writing a piece for FP and it was under my name and they put Dubai as a country. And you try to reach your editor after a story is published, they're just not responsive. So so just these mistakes happen all the time. And you don't even, it's not just even about just context, but just fact checking.
Just to add to Hassan's point about Arabic media, one big issue is, beyond the issue of state control and the fact that, these journalists are, under active threat of being, arrested or murdered or, tortured, is the funding model is extremely different. It's very different, and it's extremely difficult to really kind of, lead to any sort of sustainable independent Arabic media. I spent a lot of after leaving the Guardian, moving to Canada, where I immigrated. I spent the years before, before I joined New Lines, working with a lot of indie Arab media outlets, and I was writing for one of the satirical publications, a big part of the problem is nobody's going to pay for these outlets. At least they're not going to pay any subscription prices that are, comparable to any of the Western media outlets and that are enough to sustain any sort of quality journalism. And so in reality, most of these publications end up having to get funding from, any of the big, Open Society foundations, all these philanthropies, international media support, all of these organizations that fund them. But most of the funding, is not really core funding. It's often, that goes to like the salaries of the journalists and overhead and all of that. Most of it is project based. They're going to pay them. We're gonna pay you, I don't know, like $50,000 in order to report on this particular issue. And so then the journalists, instead of having to pursue their own enterprise ideas and do journalism, the way normal media organizations do journalism, they have to kind of orient their work towards fulfilling the requirements of these funding frameworks, in addition to having their writers spend a lot of time doing all of those funding proposals instead of actually doing any sort of journalism. And so this is one of the issues in which, one of the ways in which independent Arabic media is warped. And it doesn't say anything about the integrity of the journalists there, because most of the funding is not, meant to orient them towards a particular point of view, but towards a particular issue or a set of issues that they need to be reporting on, and that they have to in order to fulfill the funding obligations.
Okay, we need to wrap up. And before we do that, I want to thank two organizations, one NYU unit and one outside organization that co-sponsored this with us. The Arab Middle Eastern American Journalists Association, AMIJA, which kindly recorded this. And NYU's journalism, the global journalism program, NYU GloJo, which is our other partner. And we have a reception for you. We'll be around. You can ask us more questions. You can ask Karim if he approves of the hummus we ordered.
Very high standards.
Yes,
Very
so
high
I think you're going to approve. And there's copies of the line. I thought about it. Thank you.
Okay.
Also